Today we're going to start a story that begins all the way back in the year 510 BCE, give or take, and won't end until almost 1,000 years later in the fall of the Western Roman Empire around 476 CE. And that is the story of Rome. The story of Rome needs to be told in several parts. So today we're going to look at the establishment of Rome as a republic. First, we need to remember some key definitions. And we need to remember these because Rome transitioned from being a representative democracy, a republic, to becoming one of the biggest empires the world had ever seen. So remember, a democracy is a limited government with separation of powers in which voters significantly influence the government. They can do that by voting directly for laws in the case of direct democracies, and we saw an example of that with Athens, or they can do that by voting for representatives who then make decisions on their behalf. This form of government can be called a republic or a representative democracy, and that is what Rome was before the rise of Julius Caesar. Just as a brief note, direct democracies tend to work better in teeny tiny populations because if you have a majority rule system, then you need numbers small enough to make it possible for everybody to vote. Representative democracies are a way of keeping democracy at work in much larger populations when maybe not every single person is able to vote for every law every time so easily. An empire, by contrast, is a large, strong state that usually has an unlimited or authoritarian government. So instead of the government responding to the want of the people, the government tells the people what to do. It's authoritarian. In the classical period, empires were ruled centrally by an emperor. They expanded by conquest, and they had diverse or multi-ethnic populations because in expanding by conquest, they conquer other people who then become absorbed into the empire. Have a look at the growth of Rome because it's quite an impressive thing. Rome began as a minor city-state around the year 500 BC, and by 200 BC, the Roman Republic had conquered all of the Italian peninsula. Over the following 2 centuries, it conquered Greece, then Spain, then the North African coast, much of the Middle East, modern-day France, and even the remote island of Britain, just north of Europe. Around 27 BC, the Republic became an empire, and that empire endured for another 400 years. Eventually, the cost of holding such a vast area together became too great, and Rome split into 2 halves, east and west. By the year 476 CE, the western half of the empire had been destroyed by invasions from Germanic tribes, people the Romans believed were barbarians. And the eastern half of the empire, based in Constantinople, continued for several centuries after that. In the popular imagination, the way people remember the history of Rome, Rome tends to stand out for 2 main reasons. One, it's often thought of as the pinnacle, the high point, the apex, the best of Western civilization. And 2, it's often retold, its history is often told as a cautionary tale about overexpansion and the corrupting influences of empire. Remember, empires get rich as they expand, but expanding requires more resources. When they expand beyond their ability to secure their borders, that causes some security problems. Similarly, wealth from the empire has a corrupting effect, and that changes things inside the empire as well. The history of Rome for us now specifically, I'm recording in November of 2020, raises some pretty relevant questions, such as, when does a republic become an empire? What are the warning signs that democracy may be slipping away? What are the warning signs when a republic is about to fail? How much power should the leader of a government have in times of crisis in democracies? Under what circumstances do people favor a strong leader over their own right to participate in government? What does a person who wants to become the sole ruler of a republic need in order to successfully take over? And at what point can corruption, social inequality, a growing gap between rich and poor threaten the stability of a state? These are relevant questions for us now. They have been relevant questions for a long time, and Rome helps us answer them. In the United States, we have a lot of common with the history of the Roman Empire. If I told you that it was a story about a people who rebelled against a king who was being unjust, and created a government where wealthy landowners had most of the power, followed by several hundred years of conflict with everybody else to allow themselves to participate in government, you might think we were talking about the United States, but that can also describe Rome pretty easily. In addition, the corruption and the democratic slipping part of the story seems prescient for us today. It's fair to ask how much a corruption a democracy can survive before it's not a democracy anymore, and there's been a ton of research on this question. Even before the Trump election, the head of the Gallup polls noticed that as Americans perceive their government to be corrupt, they become unhappy and distrustful in government, and then begin to favor something he calls authoritarian populism. That means strong government that still tells people what to do, but that is boosted by like general broad popular support. In a way, you could see that giving rise to the Trump presidency itself. But since the Trump presidency, corruption has exploded. And there are a number of organizations that track this sort of thing. Citizens for Ethics is a fantastic source if you want to keep a critical eye on how your government is spending public money and how they're using public office and whether or not they are abusing power. The inequality question jumps out to me when I look at the chart on the bottom left of this graph that shows profits skyrocketing since 2017, but workers not being paid any more than they had been before. How long is that sustainable? It's a question that we could look to help us navigate. The connection between corruption and authoritarianism also is one that is worth exploring. There's a bunch of research from the VDEM Institute that I encourage you to look up that actually tracks the level of democracy in different countries and now in different political parties. And as you can see on the chart, the Republican Party has been gradually abandoning democratic norms over time. Note also that this chart stops at 2018, so it's missing everything that's happened recently, such as we had an election that was free and fair, and up to now, the current president has refused to concede that election, and members of his political party are supporting this idea that, like, even if he didn't win the Electoral College, even if he didn't get nearly as many votes, maybe he should still be president anyway. That is authoritarianism, and that is a big change in the way that democratic parties tend to behave. So, when I think about the history of the Roman Republic, especially towards the end, I can't help but see it in the headlines a little bit. And once you develop kind of this historical habit of seeing the world, I think that you'll be able to read these headlines with the depth that we can get from the Roman Empire's history. So let's turn to the Republic. The Roman Republic describes the first half of the history of Rome, Roman civilization. And I call it Roman civilization because it's the civilization that developed in what used to be a city-state called Rome, currently the capital of Italy, which then expanded to occupy all of Italy, and then increasingly more land, and then eventually became an empire and had the entire Mediterranean basin to itself. This Republican government was one of the earliest examples of representative democracy in the world. And like I said, it's a great case study in what can happen when democracy starts to slip. The story of the Roman Republic will end with the rise of a man named Julius Caesar in a period of chaos and violence and civil unrest, after which Rome will transition to becoming an empire with more authoritarian rule. Not to put too fine a point on it, but still from the VDEM Institute, we can note that the cycle of corruption followed by authoritarianism followed by civil unrest is a real thing, and it's something to keep an eye on. The same institute that tracks democratic indicators in different states and different political parties has quantified indications of slippage towards the civil unrest as promoted by politicians. So, as demonization of opponents of the different political parties becomes routine, as political leaders are more willing to openly incite violence, that's a warning sign that we should probably get under control. And again, I note that these charts, this data stops in 2018, after which, I mean, if anything, anecdotally, I feel like trends have gotten worse. So let's look at this Roman Republic. The Roman Republic began when Rome was a city-state. It was founded in 509 BCE after the Romans overthrew their last king. These Romans were determined not to be ruled by a tyrant again, much like the Greeks had been before them. And the wealthy landowners of Rome established their next government, a representative democracy in the form of a republic. At first, only Rome's wealthiest families, the patricians, held power. And at first, they were the only ones who could hold political or religious office. These were not only wealthy landowners, but wealthy landowners who could trace their descent to being one of the original families who founded Rome. Everybody else was considered a plebeian, a plebe, if you want to insult somebody. And no member of that group initially could hold office. As you can imagine, the workers did not love being governed by only wealthy landowners. So that led to some unrest, and over a period of about 200 years that followed, the plebeians fought for and eventually gained some power within the government. Less power, but still some. The social hierarchy of Rome mirrored its politics, so I want to kind of talk you through it first. On the top, just like in basically every other social hierarchy, you had what can be called the nobles, the aristocrats, or the landed elite. This is the social class that is wealthy and powerful because it owns land, and that wealth is passed down from generation to generation. In Rome, they were called patricians. Beneath them, we could call this group of people commoners. These are people who are much less powerful than the nobles. They did not belong to big, old, important families that had been there at the establishment of Rome, the city-state, back before 500 BC. They own little to no land. In cities, these would have been like craftsmen, merchants, that sort of thing. And in Rome, this group of people was called the plebeians. You could see the difference in class in the way that they dressed, and I have a few stills from HBO's Rome to kind of illustrate this. Just to the left of the hierarchy, towards the top, you'd have members of the patrician class. Towards the bottom, you'd have the rabble, the commoners, the plebeians. Off in the countryside, you'd have another group called peasants. It's people who live not in the cities, and they work the land. They grow the food for everybody. They live on land that belongs to somebody else. And then below the peasants, you had a massive group of slaves, a massive and growing group of slaves, because every time Rome conquered land, it took slaves. Remember that back in classical antiquity, the concept of slavery wasn't associated with race as it is in our popular imagination now. Slaves could be, people from tribes that they'd conquered. They could be people who had big debts that they had to pay off. So it wasn't a race thing, it was a status thing. In any case, this left Rome with a very rigid social hierarchy. It was hard or impossible to move up in class. Rome was very patriarchal, as were almost every other society, so men had power, women did not. And importantly, super importantly, when you look at all of the achievements of Rome and all the monuments and the Colosseum and the aqueducts, Rome was a slave state. It was a colonial power. It ran on slave labor and by exploiting colonies for resources. Rome's government, like most governments, mirrored its social hierarchy and power structures. It was complicated too, so I will try to talk you through it. The most important thing about the Roman Republic was that power was separated between different branches of government, and different social classes had different levels of representation in that government. Leading the Republic, you'd have two consuls. You could think of this like two presidents. They were elected by legislative assemblies. They served for 1 year, and they presided over the Roman Senate. And very importantly, especially to an expanding state, eventually an empire, they commanded the Roman military. Their power was limited by other positions in government, but they were effectively the heads of state. Crucially for the next part of this story, Rome had a provision for emergencies. Democracies can be kind of slow to react in an emergency, so sometimes you do need like one person to take authority and guide everybody. So, in an emergency, Rome had a provision that one of these consuls could become a dictator for a period of 6 months. Keep that in mind when we get to the story of Julius Caesar. The heart of the Roman Republic, though, was really the Senate, and this was like exclusively for the patrician class. The Senate advised on all matters pertaining to government and laws in the city, and senators were incredibly influential. This was a super prestigious position. So clearly, only patricians, only the nobles could be represented in it. At first, the Senate was the only governing the governing body in the Republic until a plebeian strike eventually won them the establishment of something called the Council of the Plebes, which gave the commoners, the plebeians, the riffraff, a voice in government and a new legislative or lawmaking body called assemblies. Assemblies had significantly less power than the other branches of government, but they were a place where the commoners, though not the slaves and not the peasants, could get some representation. Republican government was actually significantly more complicated than I've just made it out to be. There were a number of other positions in government, but the main theme, right, is that the Senate had a ton of power. You had to be upper class to be in any position that was really, really powerful. And as a compromise, the assembly represented the plebeians, the townfolk, farmers, soldiers, ordinary folk. The assembly represented those people, sorry. Meanwhile, the slaves had no rights. They were seen as possessions. They'd work as farms, in mines, as gladiators, and in the oldest profession in the world, as prostitutes. And this brings us to our notes. So what you need to retain from today more than anything else is that Roman civilization began as a small republic in modern-day Italy and gradually expanded by conquering land to become a really large empire. And this empire had a huge influence on Europe and on Western civilization generally in terms of government. Not just the republican form of government, but also Roman law was incredibly influential. Language, every language derived from Latin, like French, Spanish, Italian. Symbolism, our symbols for our republic are kind of stolen from Rome's, and once you start looking for it, you'll see it. Watch out for eagles. Religion. So Rome was polytheistic at first during the Republic, certainly. Their religion mirrored the Greeks' religion. They just changed the names for the gods. But after Rome became an empire, long after that, one of the emperors adopted Christianity, and then Christianity spread through Europe. And their legacy lives on in mostly rhetoric, but also some philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Stoicism, which is near and dear to my heart. In terms of the Roman Republic, so focusing on this first chunk of about 500 years, The Roman Republic was a representative democracy with separation of powers, which means power is divided between branches of government in order to prevent tyranny. Wealthy nobles were represented in the Senate, commoners were represented in the less powerful assembly, and there were two consuls at the head of the government. Like other civilizations, Rome's government reflected its class system. The landed elite, the aristocracy, these wealthy families that were wealthy because they owned land and they were prestigious because they'd been there when Rome was founded, had most of the political power, though commoners had some representation in the assembly. One thing to keep your eye on as our story continues tomorrow will be the way that a culture of conquest and triumph will change Rome. Rome initially hadn't been all about conquest, but gradually it expanded, taking all of Italy. And then eventually it went to war with a state called Carthage, a couple times actually, after which Rome became this just giant mass of land, an empire even. As conquest became more and more a part of the culture of Rome, and the army became more and more powerful, and they began to hold a lot of sway with the people, with the lower classes. You could think of generals like the celebrities of the day. Rome had this thing of triumphs too, where like after a successful conquest, the generals would parade through Rome and everybody would see them. And in effect, that created a competing power base that was not so in control of the Senate, of the upper class patricians. Another thing to keep your eye on is that conquest for resources leads to more conquest for more resources and to pay the bigger army that you need to conquer more land. In order to hold a giant landmass, you need a giant army. And how do you feed them? Well, you could tax your own citizens to keep your army fed, but then your own citizens aren't so happy. So it's much easier to conquer more land and feed them with the spoils of that land, which then raises the necessity for more conquest. Third, conquering land leads to getting slaves for the Romans. And that made competition for work for the lower classes. If the upper classes could have all of their needs met with slave labor, why pay anybody to do it? So, more conquest was needed to keep Rome fed, and especially more and more attention began to be spent on keeping the lowest classes happy and entertained so that they don't rebel. And then finally, major theme. Conquest causes tensions with the people who lived in the land that you conquered. Nobody likes being conquered. It's terrible, it's violent, and it sucks, and the Romans weren't exactly gracious about it. So, as they expanded land, Romans created for themselves a lot of tensions with the tribes that lived beyond the Roman borders, who the Romans would call barbarians. The barbarians get the last laugh in the story, though, and we'll get there as we progress through the rest of the story of Rome.